Thank you very much. First thing I always want to start off with when I'm talking to teachers is how many people have ever heard of Reconstruction before you got to college? How many people in high school, junior high? That's pretty good, because when I was growing up, there was very little discussion of Reconstruction. We went from the Civil War directly into Jim Crow and intentionally jumped over Reconstruction completely. The books that we use dated back to the 50s. So there was very little information that was passed on about African Americans at all, outside of slavery and then 54, the Brown decision. So at a very young age, I was very, very interested. I didn't see myself in history, but I was very, very curious. What were Black people doing at any given period of time in the United States? And I used to think that of everybody. Wonder what Chinese people were doing in the 1870s. I wonder what, if there were any people from the Middle East in the United States at any given period of time. So I became very, very interested in, the effects of not seeing yourself in history or seeing yourself as someone outside of history. What effects does that have on children? If they go to classes and they hear about greatness and they hear about the United States, but they never see themselves as a part of that greatness. So one of the efforts that I try to make in every class is to make sure that it's diverse as the class is. I want every child that goes into one of my classes or goes to one of my lectures or goes to one of my discussions to really see themselves as Americans, and to know that they held an important place in American history. That takes a lot of effort. Everybody knows that, when you have diverse classrooms, to try to make every child, no matter what culture they come from, tell some aspect of their history along the class, that can be a difficult thing. But it's a doable thing. Today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction in Louisiana, something I'm sort of immersed in, I'm sort of born to, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. One of the things that most people don't know in Louisiana was the very first occupied city that was essential for Union forces to hold was the city of New Orleans. It was captured early in the war, a joint effort between naval forces of the United States and Army forces. The naval forces were led by Admiral Farragut, and the land forces, the Army forces that came as an invading force, were led by Benjamin Butler. Benjamin the Beast Butler.
Didn't know what you read about.
Okay. Benjamin the Beast Butler. New Orleans was captured in April of 1862. And Butler couldn't immediately release all of the slaves that were there. In fact, they needed them to help hold the city. When Butler arrived, he discovered that there were African Americans, free people of color, who were serving as a contingent guard for the Confederacy. They called themselves the Native Guard. The Native Guard very quickly offered their services to Benjamin Butler, asking if they could join and become part of the regular army. After Abraham Lincoln passes the military bill, Butler does admit them in, and he makes them the Louisiana Native Guard. They will be some of the very first soldiers to see action, African-American soldiers, to see action in the U.S. Civil War. And that's very, very important, the battle that they see action in, because the battle that they see their first and their hardest fight will be the Battle of Port Hudson. And Port Hudson was the last cataract, the last fort along the Mississippi River that Union forces had not captured yet. So it became essential. If we can take Fort Hudson, we can take the entire Mississippi River. So when they actually do take Fort Hudson, the Union forces will control the flow not only of cotton up and down the river, but materials up and down the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederate Army in half. Immediately, but what we're going to be talking about is really a period of time from 1863 to 1877 today. And what's really, really important about this period of time is that African Americans become very, very active in politics. When I was in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, I just assumed, largely because of what I was told, that African Americans were given things. And you often hear that on television. We gave you your freedom. We gave you positions. But that's not true at all. We gave you the right to vote. African Americans were very active agents in their own freedom. And one example of this takes place in December of 1863. In December of 1863, at Economy Hall, 1,000 free people of color will gather. And they come from every walk of life. Most of them are artisans. Some of them are extremely wealthy. But all of them have united their forces for the same exact reason. And that is, they want the right to vote. They want to be true citizens. And what does true citizenship mean? True citizenship, at least to them, meant that you had the full participation in government. You could hold positions and you could vote for other men to represent you. At this meeting, they will sign a petition and they will send that petition on to none other than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln receives the petition, and we know this because it was hand-delivered to him. And it was hand-delivered by two men. The first was a man by the name of John Baptiste Roudanez, and we'll have Mark, one of his descendants, taking us on a tour today. This is not John Baptiste. This is the portrait is a picture of John Baptiste's brother. We don't actually have a portrait of Jean Baptiste, but he's the younger brother of Louis Charles Roudanez, noted doctor and founder of the Union and the New Orleans Tribune. And the New Orleans Tribune will be America's first daily newspaper. And the second man that was sent was a man by the name of Arnold Burtnell. And Burtnell, like Roudanez, were both free men of color. Both looked physiologically what? Tell me about their appearance so far. We've had images. What do they look like?
I was wondering if they were people of color because he was much lighter
Yeah.
than some of the other folks at the time, like say Oscar Gardner.
Do you think that was representative of the whole free black population at that time?
No.
Not at all. Why do you think that that was done?
Because they can move easily through society.
They could move easily, so that going to DC would be easier for them to navigate. People wouldn't know they were black unless they told them that they were black, right? And people make assumptions, right? And what sort of assumptions might be floating around in the 19th century about African Americans?
Uneducated.
Uneducated, that they're all meant to be slaves, that they're not cultured. These men both spoke English and French. They were both wealthy. They were both extremely cultured and well-mannered. So if you send these two people and you tell them that they're representative of New Orleans and what the free people of Louisiana are like, what do you think Abraham Lincoln and the men that received them thought?
That was representative.
Yeah, these black people aren't that bad. These free black people, they're pretty much like us. They even look like us, right? They even look like us. In picking the two men, they also made sure to send a former veteran, someone that had served in the Union cause and had been an officer in the Union cause. Burtno had served in the Native Guards, and he'd served there until Nathaniel Banks came on as the commanding officer of the 5th District. And the reason that he stopped serving isn't because he wanted to leave the military. It's because all of the blacks who were officers were mustered out forcibly. We know a lot about President Lincoln, and one of the things that I do as a regular part of my job is I lead the Papers of Abraham Lincoln project that transcribes and annotates all of the writings to and from the president. So one of the things that I sent that they can share with you are these images of the PDFs of the actual petition. But there's very little information about what Lincoln thought about these men. But we can read between the lines by looking at Lincoln's very last speech on April 11th, 1865. And in that speech, he talks particularly about the free men of New Orleans, Louisiana. Talks about them being cultured. He talks about them, what? Deserving, because of their service and their intelligence, the right to, possibly the right to vote. So for the very first time, we have a president of the United States suggesting limited enfranchisement, that some African Americans, those, and he points out, those who are intelligent and have served our nation, should have the right to vote. Inside of that audience that's listening to that very last speech, it's John Wilkes Booth. And Booth was there because his initial plan was only to capture and kidnap Abraham Lincoln, hold him for ransom, give the Confederates time to reorganize themselves and restart the war. But he decides that very night, after hearing the speech, my goal is no longer to what? To kidnap him. I've got to kill this guy. Got to kill him. On May 23rd, 1865, those free black men in the city of New Orleans would once again get together at Economy Hall. This time they would form an organization called the Friends of Universal Suffrage. And they would also elect a leader. And the man that they choose to represent them as the president of the Friends of Universal Suffrage was Oscar James Dunn, a very distant relative of mine. He was born a slave, and he rose through the ranks. The most important thing that happens to him when he's about 10 years old. His mother married a free black man from Virginia named James Dunn, and James Dunn will free him, releasing him, allowing him to go to school, become educated, and from there he will excel. And it's only because of school. He always attributed his success, his friends always attributed his success to his intellect and his ability to grasp and understand things quickly. Wanted to talk about the hallmarks of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction-era. The hallmarks of the Reconstruction-era were the three constitutional amendments that appear as a result of Reconstruction largely. And we'll talk about why they happened. But I thought it's important that we take a look at them. The 13th Amendment was passed by Congress in January 31st of 1865. It is ratified on December 6th of 1865. Does anybody see anything that's unusual about this section? There is an exception. In fact, it's an extremely controversial exception. And what's that exception? Incarceration. So incarceration makes slavery what? Permissible. So even today, when people say there's no such thing as slavery anymore, what can you say in reply? That's not true. Not true. All we have to do is convict you of something and the government can enslave you, can force you to work. Why is this important here? Why is this important? And I'll tell you what incarceration looked like before this. Our incarceration before the passing of the 13th Amendment was largely white. So most of the people who were in prison in the United States were white. And prisons were what? Very, very small. Most state prisons only had 400 or 500 people in them. The first mass incarceration in our nation happens as a reflection of the 13th Amendment. Another hallmark that isn't a change in the Constitution was the establishment of a Fredmans Bureau. The Fredmans Bureau was established under two separate acts, one that was passed in 1865, another that is passed in 1866. W.B. Du Bois once wrote, "What does it feel like to be a problem?" What does it feel like to be a problem? One of the things that we have to understand when we look at U.S. history and we start talking about African Americans is that, first of all, our coming here was the answer to what? A problem. And what was that problem? We need a permanent, cheap labor source that is reproducing, self-sustainable. That was the problem that we initially solved. Then we became a limited problem. The limited problem is, how do we keep them from what? Blending with us. How do we keep them separate? Because if they blend with us, then eventually they're going to become us, and we're not going to be able to slave them anymore. Third problem that they have with it. So the third problem. Any guesses? Hmm?
Like after the war?
No, the third problem is free black people.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, free black people were a huge problem for whites. How can we justify enslaving some of them while having these reminders that there are avenues to get free for others? Colonization in the 1830s was built around this whole concept of, instead of having this contradiction here, why don't we ship all the free people out? There were other suggestions. Maryland wanted to just take all those free people and enslave them all. Okay? But this was a much larger problem. And when I start talking about the concept of a Negro problem, a much larger problem happens after the 13th Amendment, when there's no more, slaves. What do we do with all these people? We only wanted them here for their labor, and now they're here, and there are millions of them. Yeah, so what do we do with them? The most frequently asked question I get at my work is, especially in the last year, was Abraham Lincoln a racist? And did Abraham Lincoln actually support colonization? And I kind of, in my classrooms, always use current events and juxtapose current events to events in the historical past. And one of the problems that Lincoln has is, yeah, that would make life so much easier for me politically if I could ship all the black people away. And they actually try it. He tries a limited experiment of sending 5,000 black people, only 500 would sign up to go, to an island off the coast of Haiti called LDOE. LDOE was a scam from the beginning, put together by two former slave owners. Just wanted to get government money. Nothing was set up for the people. Over 20 of them died immediately. The rest were starving on beaches, infested with sandflies and fleas. And Lincoln will have to send ships to go bring them all back to the United States. This logistical nightmare showed him what? Colonization won't work on a mass scale. We can't send 3 million people out. It's going to cost too much money. There's no single place we could send them all. And logistically, it's impossible to do. Now, we're tackling with similar issues right now, right? What are we tackling with now? How do we deal with our, immigrant population? Do we ship them? You know, there's proposals. We could ship them all back to the countries that they come from. First of all, that would cost billions of dollars, many, many billions of dollars. Then most of those people wouldn't want to go, so you'd have to capture them and detain them, which would still cost billions more dollars doing that. And then nobody's talking about the cost of housing while they're detained and shipping, the cost of actually getting them there and the logistics of doing that. So this is a problem that's very much like a problem that we're dealing with today. The Fredmans Bureau was established to deal with blacks that only had limited skills. It's not that they didn't have skills, they didn't know how to market the skills. How much do you pay me if I've never been paid? How much is my labor worth? How much do blacksmiths make if you've never been paid as a blacksmith? See, these are issues that the federal government had to intervene with and negotiate work contracts for millions of people. One thing that they also wanted, one thing that they knew would change their situation was education. How do we educate them? There are no black schools in southern states, so black schools had to be established. The first black schools that were established by missionaries that came from northern churches. But the federal government has to figure out a way to make this very standardized and something that is accessible to the millions of slaves that want it. Medical services, clothing. A lot of people think that slaves, and I love myths that sort of pop up, like slaves. How would people know the difference between a runaway slave and a free person of color? Have you ever thought about that? No, have you ever thought, like, okay, you see a guy running down the road, how do you know he's not a free black person?
Papers.
Now, they're freedom papers, but I meant, what if he said, I left my freedom papers at my house? Some states branded them, but there was a much, much simpler way. How they dress. Slaves actually, there were clothes that were just mass produced for slaves. And when people talk about slavery being a blameless, that only one group of people in America are to blame for the institution of slavery. Everyone in the United States made money off of slaves. Textile industries made clothing for slaves called Osnaburg. And Osnaburg was very coarse. It was very much like burlap clothes that were just made for slaves. So if you saw somebody running down the road with Osnaburg on, you're a slave, you know? He's a runaway slave. After Lincoln's death, he was replaced by Andrew Johnson on April 15th, 1865. Andrew Johnson is from Tennessee. He was a former slave owner, had been a senator and a governor for the state of Tennessee, and was immediately against civil rights and voting rights, the same things that Lincoln had been advocating for African Americans. So he supports black codes. And black codes were laws that were written to immediately invoke the incarceration, the incarceration factor in the 13th Amendment, allowing masters to rearrest slaves, put them back on the plantations, and force them to do the work as parts of their terms of incarceration. And when we look at modern crimes, loitering, vagrancy, most people think that these have very ancient origins, but these actually, particularly in the American South, date back to this period immediately after the war. Now I'll start talking about an individual which most of you probably have never heard of. Edward A. Pollard. Show of hands, how many people know who Pollard is and what he did? He's probably one of the most important people that America has never heard of. Okay. Now, you've all heard the term the lost cause. How many people have ever wondered where that term came from? Well, Pollard is the person who wrote the book, The Lost Cause. In fact, he will write a second book, a sequel to The Lost Cause. And The Lost Cause was his reshaping of what had happened in the Civil War. So why do we have to reshape history? Why was The Lost Cause, his book, written? Why would we reshape? Why would we change history to something else?
Because we don't like it.
Yeah.
You don't like it? Anybody else? Pollard
Resets the narrative.
resets the narrative. Why was the South so dependent on this narrative of being dominant and whiteness being greater than blackness?
That was the way society was run. It was entrenched. It was what they knew.
Their whole social system was based on slavery.
And their economic system was based on slavery as well.
Their economic system is based on slavery. So when slavery disappears, it clouded everything in the South.
They don't know how to live.
And one of the things that I love reading, and I do this every day, is I read newspapers from this period. And you have newspaper stories of masters who are running into former slaves, now Union soldiers in cities. And they see them on the sidewalks. And before the Civil War, if a slave was passing, or even a free black was passing a white person, they had to step into the street and let them walk by. And these former slaves are now they're refusing to step into the streets.
Because they don't have to.
Right. Just cause, you know. They're refusing to step into the street. So this was a whole reversal for them. something that seemed impossible. Pollard himself was a newspaper man from Virginia, also a bigamist. He had been arrested for trying to break the blockade and had made his way from Virginia all the way to Memphis, Tennessee. He was a supporter of the Confederate cause through and through, believed in slavery, believed in the dominance of the white race, and advocated for it. And he believed that the Confederacy would win the war. But what happens is the Confederacy loses the war. And immediately he has to explain why we lost. And he argues that we really didn't lose. He said the war was never about the institution of slavery. The war was about the supremacy of whites. And the thing is, the people in the North, including Abraham Lincoln, who was dead by this time, all believed that whites were what? Superior. So this was a notion he could sell to every white person in the country and get them on board with. Whites are superior naturally to blacks. We should be running things. It's never about the war. And one of the things students ask all the time is, why do we have so many Confederate what? Monuments everywhere? Well, he says that these guys actually were noble. They lost, but they did it. They laid down their lives for this greater cause of whiteness. Another individual which you probably don't know is Lyman Trumble. Lyman Trumble was an attorney first from Illinois. He becomes a congressman, and he is the person that will write the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which comes into law on April 9th, 1866. And he did this because he felt as though immediately the rights of blacks would be abridged by whites, that whites would just ignore the legislation that's passing. And he says if they're free and they have no civil rights, then people are going to abuse and exploit them. Lyman also was part of a group of radical Republicans that began working on the 14th Amendment. And I'll show you the 14th Amendment shortly after this. But this was the last straw, particularly in Memphis, home of then President Andrew Johnson, birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. A riot breaks out. The riot lasts for 3 days. It breaks out in May of 1866. African Americans, freedmen now, are massacred. And Union forces are sent in to quell the fighting. This is what they were against, the 14th Amendment. And this is why that riot breaks out. All persons born naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Okay. What's important about that? Citizenship. The concept of citizenship, and you've probably heard the term birthright citizen. That term is a product of the 14th Amendment. United States, African Americans in the United States, whether free or slave, held a very precarious position as a result of Sanford v. Scott, the Dred Scott case. They were neither citizens or slaves, and according to the Supreme Justice, they had no rights that any white man need what? Respect.
And therefore, they had no right to petition.
They couldn't petition in court, so if you were in the middle of a sale of your property to a white person, the person could just take the land from you. There was no recourse that you had, period. There are three things that I want you to remember about the 14th Amendment. First, it defines citizenship. Second, due process of the law. It creates the requirement of due process. What does that mean? What does due process mean?
Means you have to go through the laws to actually do it.
And you have to go through the courts, and the courts have to what? Treat everybody fairly. Yeah, you have to have the same process for everybody. And last but not least, the equal protection clause. This will be the vehicle which civil rights defenders will win the Brown decision, will win the Shelley decision, will win, in the case of the Elaine massacre, the Moore versus Dempsey case, will be all won using the 14th Amendment. It is one of the most powerful vehicles that we have for the defense of civil rights in the United States, and it has been since it was conceived in 1868.
It took 2 years to pass it
Yes.
versus 1 year for the 13th.
With the 13th, you have to remember there are no Confederate states that are voting for it. And this one,
You have the upset too, the states not being allowed back in because of radical Reconstruction.
and you have a president that's in favor of it.
Right.
When this passes, Johnson is not in favor of it. In fact, Johnson vetoes it, and the Congress overrides his veto. So you now have a combative president. Johnson also wants to start getting rid of people that he sees as radicals. And one of the people that he sees as a radical happens to be the Secretary of War that has sent troops to quell the rebellion. So he actually tries to get rid of the Secretary of War immediately following our revolution. So what do you think Congress feels about this? Do they trust their president?
No, they get very frustrated.
Extremely frustrated. And they're very afraid of what might happen. So, one of the things I love about Reconstruction, but I tell people Reconstruction teaches us a lot of lessons about today, because we're in the same exact place right now, where there's a distrust of the government, vast distrust of the government. Johnson is brought up on impeachment charges in a scandal called the Tenure of Oath scandal for his attempts to remove Stanton as Secretary of War. Yes,
I have a question.
sure.
He's trying to remove Stanton as Secretary of War, but who appointed Stanton Secretary of War? Did he or did Lincoln?
Lincoln.
Okay.
But he wants his own Secretary of War. One that'll be
He is,
supportive to the Confederate cause.
that's what I was thinking. It had to be Lincoln because if he appointed him,
He could do that, but this is why I said he gets in an argument with Congress, because Congress is like, look, this guy is a supporter of the Confederacy we just put down. If we allow him to pick people, then he's going to just he's going to put the Confederacy back into power. They had just fought the Civil War.
Was that Lincoln was elected president, not Johnson.
Yeah.
So then Lincoln's staff, what the radical Republicans felt, was that Lincoln's staff
Should remain the same.
as the administrative staff, because Lincoln was the one who was chosen as president, whether he was shot in the head or not.
Right.
So, but that was the argument that Johnson then has. It brings up a whole other constitutional argument.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I should be allowed to, he should be allowed to.
That hasn't happened
Right.
before either. That never happened before. Doesn't happen.
Now, having this one massive riot take place immediately following the Civil War was bad.
And then this happened.
Then another one happens. As black leaders and the Friends of Universal Suffrage are gathering together in anticipation of a 15th Amendment being passed and the 14th Amendment, they begin to select delegates who they want to represent them. Their meeting is rated, and their meeting isn't rated by discontent former Confederate soldiers who were just acting on their own behalf. They're police in uniforms that are a part of the raid, and they come from all directions. They first start marching down the street as if they were in a parade, and they're all in their uniforms, and then bands of other former Confederates join them and surround the building, and they go into the hall and they begin killing the delegates. General Philip Sheridan was commander of the city at that time. And this is a letter that he writes on August 2nd, 1866. And he's writing this to Ulysses S. Grant, who is still commander of the armies, and telling him what happened. The more information I obtain of the affair of the 30th in this city, the more revolting it becomes. It was not a riot. It was an absolute massacre by the police, which is not excelled in murderous cruelty by that Fort Pillow. This reference to Fort Pillow was a battle in Arkansas. And many of the Union forces who were fighting at Fort Pillow, the black volunteers, were former slaves. When Confederates are confronted with their former slaves, an order is given: do not capture them, do not give them aid, kill on sight. So instead of capturing African American soldiers, they're all murdered. This frightens Congress. Okay, so now we have the conquered states, the former Confederate states, are now actively, their governments are now actively starting insurrections aimed at taking away the rights of the people that we just have given rights to and freedom to. Congress believes that they have to act immediately. So they passed the Reconstruction Acts. And all the former states of the Confederacy are a part of the Reconstruction occupation, save one state. Anybody want to guess what the state is? Tennessee, because Tennessee goes ahead and makes the pledge and does not become a part of the occupation. New Orleans is a part of what is the 5th District, so Louisiana and Texas are part of the 5th District, and at this time, they're governed by Philip Sheridan. Philip Sheridan is loved in the New Orleans African American community at the time. He's extremely supportive of African Americans, he was overwhelmed by their service in the Union Army. And immediately he begins to write Washington and say, look, I can't trust any of these former Confederates. I want to replace the entire government there. And he does just that. And he says, I think it's time for us to start allowing blacks to participate in government. So he does the very first appointments of African Americans as political officers. And it's no mistake why he chooses the two people he chooses. The city council of the city was actually two boards. It was a bicameral city council. There was a senior board that acted as a Senate, and there was a junior board which acted as a House of Representatives. And to the senior board, he appointed Francis Ernest Dumas, a dashing soldier who had been the son of a slave owner. He had slaves of his own, and when the Civil War, when African Americans were allowed to join Union forces, he released all of his slaves so they could join the Union. Oscar James Dunn, we've pointed to him in the past, born a slave, had risen up in the social rankings, and was extremely well-liked and respected, particularly by the freedmen, because they believed he shared what? Their experiences. He's been a slave. We can trust him. He's been a master. We can't necessarily trust him. He did let him go, but that was after the war. You know? Dunn would rise from that post, and he would serve in a number of other posts. The city council is the very first post that he serves on. And in 1868, he is elected lieutenant governor of the state. This broadside shows all of the black delegates that had recently been elected in that 1868 election. And you can see this is an enormous slate. There's only one other Reconstruction state that will have more black participation in its government. Does anybody want to guess? Yeah, Charleston, yes. South Carolina is the only state that will have more representation, black representation in government than Louisiana.
I've seen this picture so many times.
Mm-hmm.
Usually it's in the front, oh look, there's lots of African Americans in politics now. But do you have more information about where this broadsheet comes from? Because at the top it says extract from the Reconstruction Constitution within Louisiana.
These broadsides were printed. They ran in newspapers. They were put on walls. I know something about every single individual on there. There were some of them that multiple family members, the Duparts, the Isabels, they're two Isabel brothers, the McCartys were also extremely influential. And New Orleans is unique in there will be a schism inside of the Republican Party. The Republican Party itself will split in half. Some backing the governor, Henry Clay Warmoth, the other half backing Oscar Dunn as the legitimate voice of the state. It's the very first time in history that we have a state that has this sort of factions and there's a black person leading the faction. So I would often say that he was America's first black political machine. I mean, he had his own faction. It was called the Radical Republicans. The last of the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution is the 15th Amendment. What's important for your students to know about the 15th Amendment is that it is male universal suffrage. Although the right to vote is afforded to all males over the age of 18, it is not afforded to who? Women.
And actually,
Yeah.
21, right?
21 at this time, exactly. One of the things that immediately starts to happen when blacks have the right to vote and when blacks are participating in government was resistance. And we're talking about mass resistance and violent resistance. Remember what you guys said just a few minutes ago about slavery being at the heart of Southern identity and culture. Okay? What would you do to preserve your culture if you thought it was disappearing completely? Well, Confederates would answer to that anything it takes. And you begin to see the emergence of hate groups. And these hate groups are terrorist groups that strike often at the dead of the night, burning down houses, burning down churches, burning down schools, killing registrars, people that are registering people to vote, killing black politicians, intimidating at polls. And this image shows a masked man shooting through a doorway at a black family. There was a law that was created as part of the Enforcement Acts or during the period of the Enforcement Acts called night riding. And night riding was to, under the cloak of night and with masks, to raid people. And it's on the books. In fact, what's really strange about the Elaine massacre is the black men that are meeting at the church to try to sue their plantation owners are charged with night riding for meeting secretly under the cover of night. Everything in Louisiana will come to a head in 1872. In 1872 was a gubernatorial election. And this gubernatorial election pit William Pitt Kellogg against John McEnery. Kellogg is the Republican candidate. McEnery is the Democrat. It's very clear from election results who the winner was. And these are the election results. So the Republican candidate, William Pitt Kellogg, gets 72,890 votes, or 56.88% of the vote. The Democrat, McEnery, gets 55,000, 43.12% of the vote. However, and this is another point if you're making comparisons between the past and the present, this is another example where the past sort of mirrors, where the present mirrors the past. Despite this very clear victory on the part of Republicans, Democrats will maintain what? It's all rigged. We didn't lose the election. Our candidate should be the governor of the state. In fact, every one of the people on our slate should have won. So how do you settle this? Well, immediately, and this is another thing that's unique about the state. In 1872, they couldn't settle it. Congress, the state legislature, they had not two factions, they had two separate governments in Louisiana. There were two people simultaneously governor of the state. They were, throughout the parishes, there were various politicians who were running on the election that maintained that they were the rightful sheriff, the rightful judge, the rightful delegate, and probably the most controversial of the races was for state senator. PBS Pinchback, an African-American man, had won based on the polls. But Congress refuses to sit him because they said there's a dispute. So actually, when they finally sit him, he only sits for 1 day. He still has the shortest term in American history. They allow him to sit for 1 day and then say, okay, your term's over. And he loses his seat. Oh, long before, everyone knew PBS Pinchback was black. It's just he could pass if he had desired to do so. What is really important, and what we're going to talk about now, is 1872 and the results of the election in Grant Parish. So in Grant Parish, there were delegates up for election in the positions of sheriff and judge. And these are the two candidates. The Republican had Dan Shaw and R.C. Register, and the Democrats had a man by the name of Christopher Columbus Nash and Alphas Kazabat. Despite a clear victory by the Republicans, the Democrats in the parish refused to accept the election. And just before the candidates were to be installed, former Confederates in the area mustered their weapons together and decided to attack the county seat. Their intentions were to forcibly install their candidates as the legitimate sheriff and judge. Blacks, hearing of the incoming assault on the parish seat, will band together, go to the county seat to try to defend it. The battle takes place on Easter Sunday, April 13th. And what African Americans had not expected was how many Confederates would turn out. Hundreds of Confederates turned out. They outgunned, they even had artillery, so they had cannons with them. And they man an assault on the building. African Americans tried to surrender when the building is set aflame with them inside. And they come out and they turn over their weapons. They put their hands up and they get on their knees and they're all executed.
Yes.
And that case will go to the Supreme Court. It's renamed the Cruikshank case. And when you're teaching your classes about how we get to the Compromise of 1877, it's important to understand the role that the Cruikshank case plays in that movement toward the election of 1877. The Cruikshank case goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And although hundreds of people had participated in this act, only a handful of white Confederates are brought up on charges. What the result of the Cruikshank case and the ruling in the Cruikshank case is, it was inappropriate for the federal government to intervene because homicide was a state charge, not a federal charge. The federal government maintained it unless a federal employee, unless a federal officer, unless a U.S. soldier is killed, then the federal government shouldn't have any involvement in this. This sent a very, very clear signal to former Confederates. If we control our local courts, think about courts today. If we control our local courts, what? We control the outcome of cases. There won't ever be anybody convicted of any act of heinous violence as long as we control the courts.
When you,
1874.
when you mentioned Reconstruction, like hearing about it in school, I'm from Memphis Parish, and they never taught us about the Never.
Never.
I didn't learn about it until I got to Southern. I had never heard of it.
You'll see. I'll show you in a second.
Marker there that said Colfax Riot. They just
Yeah.
took it down like last year.
Oh, no, I know that, but we didn't. I'm from Memphis Parish, and they did not teach us that.
And Coshota, their massacre's even worse. There's no pretext of an election. They just start going out and killing black officers and Republican officers. And they even hire gunslingers to do this in some parishes, just to go and hunt them down and shoot them in the streets. The culmination of this, all this fighting in these smaller parishes, will lead to a major showdown in the city of New Orleans. That showdown will take place on September 14th, 1874, when supporters of McHenry will muster together 5,000 people. Not 500, 5,000 people, and artillery. And they will take over the city of New Orleans, literally fighting the Metropolitan Police. They will hold the city of New Orleans for 3 days before federal troops, additional federal troops, are sent in and the city is taken back. Now, remember what I said about Pollard and his concept that, we can lose the Civil War, but win this much greater war that's taking place. This is the base of the Liberty Place Monument. And when you read it, it says the United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election of November 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. And that sat prominently at the foot of Canal Street from the 1880s, when I think it was the 1880s that it was put up, 1890s, all the way until Dutch Morial, Ernest Morial, becomes mayor of the city. The most prominent position a statue could stand. In fact, the Henry Clay statue that sits in Lafayette Square, that's what stood there before that monument was put. They moved Henry Clay to put that monument there. There's a lot of reasons why Confederates would have embraced the Battle of Liberty Place. First, with Farragut and Butler taking the city, Confederates were left in a difficult place. We can abandon the city, or we can fight and see it destroyed. And Confederates chose to abandon the city. Not only did they abandon the city, but they left their wives and children to the mercy of Benjamin the Beast Butler. This is something they weren't able to cope with, because they were always seen, looked at as not having done everything they could to have fought the Union forces. But they were able to redeem themselves in many people's eyes immediately after. This next image went through a very, very popular magazine, Frederick Leslie's Illustrated. It's done by Nass. And this woman represents Louisiana, and she's being held hostage. You see her tied up by debt and taxes, and there's a noose being put around her neck. And this is supposed to be Reconstruction government, or forced rule over Louisiana. This isn't the only newspaper that was running ads and cartoons that were critical of Reconstruction. This is another cartoon which shows Ulysses S. Grant as commander of U.S. forces. He also led all of these Reconstruction areas, these 5 areas. And you see the former Confederate states as virgins being offered up on the altar of radicalism. And who's holding them down? Yeah, African Americans are the monsters that are holding them down.
I used that particular cartoon.
Yeah.
In my class.
And if you look at each of their tiaras, you can tell which Confederate state: Carolina, Texas. There's Louisiana. The cost of Reconstruction had begun to change the hearts and minds of many Northerners. And the concepts of Pollard's white supremacy was catching on in the nation. So there is one Republican that is asked to figure out the election of 1872, and he chairs a committee on what should we do about all of the massacres, violence, and this failed election. His name is William A. Wheeler. How many people, until this moment, how many people have ever heard of William A. Wheeler? Okay. Wheeler will be a part of something that is called the Wheeler Compromise. And what Wheeler decides to do in his committee is, why don't we try to appease the Democrats? Why don't we give them some of the seats to make peace? Okay. Yes, they use violence, but maybe they won't use it again if we give them seats in government. If we give them sheriff's seats or judges' seats. This is a letter, and this letter is something we recently found in our collection. And it's a letter between Frederick Douglass and PBS Pinchback, and they're talking about the Wheeler Compromise. And it says, the compromise is part of that policy which we tried and failed 15 years ago, which sought to conciliate wrong instead of stamping it out. It belongs to that wisdom which refused to reinforce Sumter for fear of exasperating our Southern brethren, when those same brethren had muskets in their hands and bullets in their pockets. This cowardly policy did not avail then, and it will not avail now. It is the same influence that keeps your seat vacant in Senate. That's as he's talking to Pinchback, who was part of that 1872 slate of politicians. I do not despair, however, of the future. Do nothing rash, stand your ground, bide your time. You are postponed but not defeated. December will be here, and the presidential election is only a little further off. The presidential election of 1876 is the election that he's talking about, and this is Douglas. Douglas is telling Pinchback, look, don't worry. 1876 will be here. We'll have another Republican president. We'll have Johnson out of the way. And guess what? Things will go back to the way they were. There's never been somebody so wrong before ever. Douglas is completely off. This is the Cruikshank ruling, comes right before the election. And what the Cruikshank ruling does is open the pathway for violence to be used as a political tool. These are the sorts of ads that are running in local newspapers which suggest or at least highlight violence. Here you see an immigrant who's now got the vote, and he's using the vote as a cudgel. And this is supposedly an Irishman. You have the former Confederate, and he's using what? The lost cause to stab the former Union soldier. And you have the industrialists. Now all have joined forces around the lost cause. And what has slipped away from African Americans, according to the image? The vote. That's a ballot. That little round thing is a ballot box. So just beyond his grasp is the ballot. Here you have another image, this time of a black man coming to ballot boxes. You see the Democratic and the Republican boxes, and he's being intimidated in the polling place, guns held to his hand. Yeah. The two candidates most people know. Most of you have probably taught about the two candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, versus Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. The election of 1876 is the bloodiest election in American history. Violence is widespread, particularly in the states of Louisiana and Florida. There is so much violence and corruption that few people believe that they can ever get to the bottom of who actually won the election. So we're at a standstill. And at this standstill, they make a decision. We've got to figure out who's going to decide this election. So it's decided that the House of Representatives would form committees, and they will decide who the next president will be. The Republicans really want to retain the presidency and maintain in committees that we're willing to do whatever we can to make sure that Hayes is our next president. The Democrats are willing to make a trade. And that trade is forever known in our history as the Compromise of 1877. And we're almost at the end. There are 5 things that I want you to know about the Compromise of 1877. First, Union troops, Republicans will agree to remove Union troops from the South. And this is important because of the enforcement acts. Without Union military presence there is no one to enforce the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments or the Civil Rights Act. The federal government also would vow to look the other way when it comes to race. Do whatever you want to black people. We won't interfere. One of the things that the South maintained even before the war was that the North exercised an unfair economic advantage. And that advantage was the only east route of the railroad was in the North. So to go to either coast, to go to the East Coast, you had to, if you were in New Orleans, you had to go north on the Great Northern Railroad, connect in Kentucky or Ohio to Eastern railroads, and then go east. the South said, if we give you this election, we want the North and we want the Republicans to swear that they'll build an East-West system in the South. And they did. I know a lot of you are asking, why do I have this picture of convicts, right? Convict leasing. Convict leasing starts during Reconstruction. Convict leasing will escalate to an exponential scale during Reconstruction and immediately afterwards. All of these work projects, when we start talking about northern banks investing in the South and building a railroad, requires what? Labor. And there are only two ways to get labor. Either you're going to tax the rich people, and we're going to have the labor paid for with taxes, which we all pay, or we just arrest more black people and we make them build the railroad. And that's what they decide to do. The most profitable business in every former Confederate state during Jim Crow was the prison system. The prison system operated in the black for many, many decades. And it is a lot of people say, well, how did the South catch back up to the North? How did they rebuild the South? They used slave labor again, but slave labor came in the form of convicts.
And they were sort of stupid people,
Yes,
like not stepping to the side of the road.
you got it. The fourth, northern banks agree to loan money to the South, to the southern states, to rebuild southern economies and infrastructures. And it's often referred to, this period of time is often referred to as the New South. So the New South starts in 1877 and goes all the way to 1913. Here you see sharecroppers working on one side of the road, and you see a new factory on the opposing side of the road. And you would see this during this New South period, industries, particularly like Gadsden and Bessemer, where you have steel and things like that are trying to be developed here. You'll see industry alongside agriculture. Last concession that was made was the appointment. The Democrats would say, we'd really like a cabinet level position. Now you have to think about how ridiculous this is. It's a Republican cabinet, but we like on the president's cabinet to be able to pick a cabinet seat. The Republicans refused to let them have Secretary of War for obvious reasons, which we've talked about. The second most powerful position in the cabinet at that time was the Postmaster General. Somebody tell me why the Postmaster General is so powerful. It was the national mode of communication was mainly, because there were telegrams, but mainly the largest bureaucracy at the time. When we start talking about jobs, the Secretary of War has the most jobs, but the next agency that has the most jobs at this time is a Postmaster General. So this gave him lots of jobs he could give to cronies. And where is he from? Tennessee keeps coming up in this lecture. It just keeps coming up. Now, I also want you guys to think about Wheeler for a minute. We said that Johnson, the biggest gain that they got immediately after the Civil War is the fact that Johnson became president. And he became president only because Lincoln had him. He wanted somebody on the other side that might pull in some votes as vice president. So who do you think is Hayes's vice president. The Republicans, for the most part, won't put in somebody, again, that's like Johnson. But if they had to pick somebody based on their actions and support, who would they pick? Who had given them concessions after 1872, given them seats in Louisiana? Wheeler. So Wheeler, even though you've never heard his name, Wheeler, the guy that did the Wheeler Compromise, becomes the vice president of the United States, largely because he had supported the southern states during that period of time following the election of 1872. There are two systems that emerge out of Reconstruction as ways to return African Americans back to de facto forms of slavery. The first we've talked a little bit about, and that is convict leasing, and the notion that you could abuse the loophole in the 13th Amendment to re-enslave individuals. The second emerges out of the plantation system, and I understand why slaves would fall for it. It's a very, very simple system. They're duped. The system maintains that the plantation owner has the vital resource that is needed, the land, and that the sharecropper has the labor. And all I have to do is let you live on the land, and we just split the proceeds of the harvest. However, that doesn't work very well, right? Because there are lots of things when you move into a slave shack that's on 50 acres, you still need to eat. You still need mules until the mechanization comes around. You still need seed. You get all that from the plantation store. So what happens is a form of debt slavery. And this debt slavery that emerges during sharecropping will tie this agrarian labor force back to the land. So
It's like modern feudalism.
Modern feudalism. Okay. There are also two forms of extra-legal violence that begin to emerge that to deal with African Americans and to make sure that they never again rise to where they had been during Reconstruction. The first form of violence is lynching. And lynching is just an extra legal form of mass murder. So there has to be 3 or more individuals involved in a lynching. A lynching doesn't necessarily mean that you were just hanged. You could be shot, you could be burned, you could be chopped to pieces. And the second is more of an urban form. So in larger cities, you have race riots, and we no longer use the term race riots to describe that form of mass violence. We call them massacres now. And that is it.